Okay, there we go. Sorry, this is my first time on Zoom.
That's great. Awesome.
Okay. Okay, but here we go.
Beautiful.
I think I've got most of the intro out of the way, so I'll get right into it. What I've got here is sort of, I'm going to be talking about the Algonquin Dome in general, which is, this is best shown on this diagram as sort of this core part of Ontario where we're north of the, what most people used to in Southern Ontario, sort of all the farmland. When you're driving up north, you kind of come up past what we call the land between, and you get up into what is termed the Algonquin Dome, although this isn't an official boundary, but it's a really high point in Central Ontario. It's kind of what most people relate to canoe country because it's where we have all the hills, inaccessible land that wasn't developed for years, and a lot of where we do a lot of our backcountry trips. So that's sort of where I focus this talk on, is sort of this Algonquin Dome area. And on this map here, if you check on Ontario forest regions, it shows it's kind of in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest. So that's a term that you often hear when we're discussing the type of forest in all surrounding the Great Lakes primarily, except kind of around Thunder Bay. And one unique feature that we have in the Algonquin Dome is it's such a height of land that the boreal forest, features of the boreal forest occur in Algonquin Park. So this picture I have on the right here is of the boreal forest. It's a photograph taken from M&R aerial photography, but a lot of people who paddle a lot of the watersheds of the park will probably recognize it. I probably could have told you that I took it in the park and that you'd believe me because it looks so similar and so familiar. It's because the wetlands of the park are really the areas where boreal forest intermixes with Great Lakes St. Lawrence. And this is sort of, I know when you go to the visitor center, they sort of give you a bit of an idea of this, sort of a rundown of boreal versus Great Lakes St. Lawrence. But I think people who do canoe trips probably are most familiar with it because the wetlands and watercourses are primarily where you get this boreal intermixing. So I think it probably is something that looks familiar to a lot of canoe trip folks. So on that, this map shows the forest types that we have in the province. This is a LiDAR map that M&R gives out. And so this is actually publicly available information. And what it shows is the dominant cover by certain forest types. So anybody who's familiar with trees, at least a little bit, might recognize some of these names. On the left here of this lighter color palette is the softwood trees. So this is like the pines, spruce, and then the soft hardwoods like poplar and birch. So primarily you'll notice that there's this swath on the east side of the Algonquin Dome, or in this case, Algonquin Park, where you have what looks more like this pastel color over there, which is the softwoods. And that's just a result of glacial outwash. So that is actually the lowest part of the park. If you were to turn it sort of on a plane, that half of the park you would notice is in a low sort of valley feature. And when the glacier was retreating, it essentially sorted all this sand into what you can sort of see as that pastel there. And that sand left behind prime habitat for a lot of our softwood species. So we have this dome primarily on the west side of Algonquin Park, and it really drops off on the east side, getting towards the Ottawa Valleys, not far up, or that is kind of the Ottawa Valley. That's all draining into the Ottawa on the east side there. So off the park's main drainage, we have this lower elevation sort of forest that that's primarily where the logging goes on in the park, because our softwood trees are mostly what logging's after. So there's a lot of changes from west to east, and that's one of the main things. So when you hear about logging, forest fires, all that stuff, it's primarily east side of the park, sandy, dry type habitat. So one other thing that I noticed.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but urgently important. Check the waiting room. I don't know if it's you or Alexander, but someone check the waiting room. I've been getting texts from a bunch of people.
If you just hit participants, you'll see the waiting room at the top there, right?
Admit all. There we go.
There you go. Let them in. let them.
Alex,
gotta
can I
figure out-
make a suggestion?
Sure.
Just that if he makes you co-host, then he can still share his screen and you can still watch the waiting room.
Yeah, we've played with that a bit, and we've had a bit of difficulty, and so we'll try it
Okay.
again for next round. But I appreciate the suggestion.
Okay.
Back to you, Ryan.
So one other thing that I want to point out on this map for people I think that are familiar with the park is that, again, with the changes between the east and west side, when you're on the west side, it's primarily hillier. The lakes are actually colder. I don't know if anybody notices that. It's also higher elevation, like I said. And what it shows here is this in yellow is sugar maple yellow birch forest. That's all that yellow. And even if you don't know what a sugar maple yellow birch forest is, I think if you spent time in any of the western half Algonquin and you saw a picture of sugar maple yellow birch forest, you would recognize it because it's just sort of like the look of the whole west side of the park. And so I think, I think that primarily when you do canoe trips and you're on portage, you won't really see this stuff because we kind of just have our head down on the portage lake to lake. But this sort of stuff influences a lot of where fishing might be good. For example, the areas that are deeper on the west side probably tend to feature more cold water species versus the east side, which is more warm water species. So depending on what you're looking for. So there's a lot more that can be told from the vegetation. And this is all publicly available information about forest types in the park. So this is sort of gives you a bit of an idea of the landscape level. So I made these 3 points because before I continued, I wanted to sort of summarize life on the dome, something like on a high point. So what it leads to is a low nutrient system. So if you think of a watershed and as it's going down, picking up nutrients as it passes through farmland or development or backyards or anything like that, as it does all this, it picks up nutrients and introduces it to the biotic system. But if you're at the top, you're essentially just being fed by either just rain or seepage, and there's no nutrients in the system. And so this leads to low bioproductivity, essentially. And this is what in the aquatic system they call an oligotrophic system. So that's primarily what we have across Algonquin Park. This leads to comparatively low species diversity. It also leads to a low abundance. So that would mean how many fish are in a lake. The biomass of a fish in a lake are low on places like the Algonquin Dome. And all of the native species, that includes vegetation, but also fish, aquatics, bugs, everything, is adapted to these conditions because they've lived here forever. So they're adapted to low nutrient. And that's kind of one of the, especially with the vegetation, one of the leading things you'll find is that all the species here have different adaptations for finding nitrogen or finding phosphorus. They've had to come up with other ways than getting it from the soil because it's so poor high up on the watershed. So right before I go on to, I threw this in there, I wanted to make a point. I guess I kind of already addressed it a little bit, but this is me just taking pictures of some plants while my dog waits in the canoe. This is sort of just a photo of what, when you go on a canoe trip and you might be like 6 lakes in, there's not a lot of overlap, it seems, between people that are good at identifying plants and that like to go on backcountry trips. When you read most papers out of Ontario about rare plants, generally the methodology was roadside surveys, 50 meters on either side of access roads and stuff like that. It seems that the adventurous and the plant surveys often don't overlap. So I think that this is sort of me suggesting that there could be more people out there that learn how to identify plants that also canoe trip. So I wanted to throw that in there. Now, to keep you interested, everybody always asks about this, the carnivorous plant. So to keep this talk interesting and not teach you the difference between sedges and rushes or something, I thought I would share. Yeah, we could do that some other time. But I thought I would share a bit about carnivorous plants that we have. So some probably are familiar and some may not be. So at the bottom, you have a pitcher plant. I think that they made the news a little bit recently just because some research that came out of Algonquin Park actually found them eating salamanders during one of their salamander studies. So that made the news a bit. And this one probably looks familiar if anybody's looked at logs floating in boggy areas or boggy lakes, the sundew. And then this one on the left here is the bladderwort. They're pretty neat looking when they flower. They all look really different when the flowers come up, but they all look very similar underwater. And they're actually an aquatic plant that traps bugs underwater. And when it flowers, it shoots it above the bog mat and shows off what colors they have. So, and there's a whole pile of different species in Algonquin Park. They're all adapted to this low nutrient environment. And you can actually see in this picture, like the sundew is all along the bottom here. So this is obviously a really nutrient poor environment that everything is having to catch bugs essentially in order to survive. So this is the bladderwort. It's pretty weird, but you can find these almost any pond in Algonquin Park. If you reach under the canoe and pull up some weeds, there's a pretty good chance that it's part of the bladderwort family. And there's these little black bladders. These black bladders have food in them and digestive enzymes mixing together, and the plant's extracting nutrients. And then you can kind of see over here, there's not many. This must be like a very successful plant, but there's a few empty traps here. So essentially there's an empty trap that waits for microscopic bugs or algae to drift in, traps it in the trap, and then releases its fluids and extracts the nitrogen and stuff that it can't find in the soil because it's up at the top of a watershed. This picture I added is from Popular Science, and it's sort of a hand-drawn diagram of what they see under microscopes when they watch the bladders operate on Daphnia. So this gives you an idea of like the freakish entry hole of that bladder. This is going on under every Algonquin pond and lake and wetland. Is this sort of nutrient extraction from the benthic invertebrates is essentially what it is. This is a mayfly taken under a compact microscope. So you can't quite tell, I guess, but this is the bladder. The outside part is the bladder, the green, and it has trapped this whole mayfly in it, and it eventually will try to get the door shut on it, and then it will release its enzymes and extract all kinds of nutrients for survival. So it's hard to see. You can't see the microscope, but all you can see is that first picture I showed you, the black. But if you normally, when you pull one of these out, usually there's not that much black. You can usually see the odd trap set, and then most of them open waiting. So it's something you can see just with your eye in the sun. This just gives you an idea. I think probably 12 or 13 species of bladderwort in Algonquin Park. Maybe not quite, but there's at least 10. And this is a handful of ones that I've taken from around. This one here, you can see even its little bladders under the water. These two actually usually put them underneath the bog mat. So this one's reaching through a bog mat to flower, but underneath the bog mat, there's traps. And that's kind of the same actually for horned bladderwort here. So pretty neat group of plants that's really diverse in Algonquin Park. And then this one's basically what often people call the Venus flytrap. It's quite similar, and they are quite closely related, and they like the same habitat too. So it's not far off. But essentially, all those little droplets you see are sticky and sweet. So when a bug lands on it, it's sort of the hairs trigger, and it sends a hormone reaction to the plant that closes the leaf. And same sort of thing, a little less scientific because it doesn't close off the bag and mix in enzymes. It extracts it from the surface. But it's similar process. When it's done digesting, essentially opens it up, and the dried carcass just falls off, and it waits for another victim essentially. We actually have two species in Algonquin Park. One has the leaf, this is not one of them actually, but the leaf is heart-shaped, and that one's called round-leaved sundew. And then we have one that's sort of spoon-shaped, and it doesn't have the heart carve out at the base. That one's intermediate sundew. So we actually have two species in the park, and they can be side by side on the same log sometimes. So it's kind of neat. You can look out for that. And then this is the famous pitcher plant with a unfortunate victim. They have a really sticky and sweet rim that's slippery. You can see these like silica hairs pointing downward. So anything that falls in, can't get out. And essentially it just waits till the thing drowns. And the fluid in there is already digestive secretion. So it's probably already has a few spiders and other bugs that are already getting digested at the bottom of that soup. And if you see them in the bog mat and you look in them, I've never actually seen one with one of these salamanders in it, but I've seen all sorts of stuff. They eat tadpoles and spiders and beetles and all sorts of things. I've heard of someone that found a drowned mouse in one. So if you look in them, you never know what you're going to find. And then I threw this in there just because everybody likes orchids pretty much, and it's in the same habitat. So they're these orchids, especially, they're like most orchids, are accustomed to really challenging environments. This pink one on the left is no more than this little stalk, one leaf, and a flower that opens up for a few weeks and then disappears. So and you'll find them sort of out in the bog mats in the park, and same with these other ones. This lady's tress is part of a group that there's maybe 8 or 9 species in the Algonquin dome, and they're all very tough to tell from each other, but at least learning that it's a lady's tress and spirals, hence the genus Spiranthes, is at least a good start. And then, yeah, so I threw in a bit about ferns too, because ferns, I feel, are an interesting point on the Algonquin dome, partly because all the exposed rocks and cliffs. We have some cliff ferns that are kind of rare elsewhere in the province, other than up on Lake Superior on the cliff, so it sort of makes sense. One of them being rusty woodsia here. This is, you can find it on some cliffs in the park, and especially I found it especially on the southwest side. If you hike the trails, like if the trail takes you near a cliffside and it's really small, it kind of looks it's no bigger usually than you see in this picture here, and there's nothing quite like it. So that's a unique fern we have. The other two aren't so unique. Northern oak fern and hay-scented fern, but they again seem to be fairly specialized on the high altitude Algonquin dome. And then even more interesting I find is we have this cliff specialist called fragrant wood fern that likes cliffs. In particular, it really only grows on them. And I've only seen it in 2 places ever, and it was out of Dawson City, Yukon one time, and then I've seen it on the west side of Algonquin Park in one spot. And it seems that wherever it grows, it's rare. It's kind of just an uncommon plant as it is. And sometimes it's just the way that they are. They're really specific about where they grow. And it's part of this group called the wood ferns, the Dryopteris, which is really diverse and might take a long time to learn, especially because they hybridize. So I threw in 2 common ones here: crested wood fern. This one's in most wetlands in the park, and then marginal wood fern, which is in most forests in the park. But Algonquin Park has its own wood fern that's only ever been found in the park. And it's actually a hybrid of fragrant and marginal wood fern. It was only ever found once, and if anybody knows Greenleaf Lake on the east side of the park, that's where it was found. That lake is all ringed by cliffs, and they found it on the cliffs in the 80s, and then that was the only time it was ever described. So they called it Dryopteris algonquinensis. So that's kind of a neat thing. We have our own wood fern park. And yeah, it would be remiss not to discuss old growth. It's always something I know that people are interested in the park. The challenging thing is that, like I'd mentioned before, it's almost more old growth trees now, unfortunately. Most areas that you can visit anyway that are identified as old growth on Jeff's map or on old park maps, are really only a handful of trees left, but still worth visiting at the time. This one on the left is at Dixon Lake red pine stand, if you've ever seen that. It's on the Friends of Algonquin map on the east side of the lake, and it shows, I think they're known to be 250 years old or something like that. But my picture is most of it. So, you know, it's hard to say if that's a forest or if that's just a few trees that they couldn't get at. But that's sort of an unfortunate part about Algonquin old growth, is it's mostly visiting large trees, especially when it comes to the pine. That's a bit untrue when it comes to hemlock stands. We still do have some pretty big old growth hemlock stands. They just don't have the physical size of pine, so they're not quite as, you almost have to be told it's old growth hemlock. to know. So that's the only downside about those. Those are mapped on here pretty well. If anybody's familiar with ancient forest in research, they do a lot of work in Temagami, which has some of the best old growth pine, and I think left in Canada. And then they do some work in the park. A lot of what they map out is hemlock old growth, but this map, they designed it to show where old growth is within and without of protected areas in the park from logging. So that's not exactly what I was trying to use it to show per se, but if you look at the pink and red and you look at the dark green, that is essentially what they are identifying as old growth, because the light green is protected areas that they've already established within the park. And the dark green and the red are what they've identified as old growth forest. So you can kind of see, by and large, if you separate the dark green and red from the green and the tan color or the peach, you have maybe 5% or less land cover, and that includes the hemlock. So unfortunately, old growth isn't really a big story in Algonquin Park. There's just been too much logging over the years, essentially, and particularly the whole western half, like I showed, being that sugar maple mix and the high ground, that was really where the large white pines were at the time, or at least what we think a lot of they were. And so it really was what they came for. It was what the loggers came to the park for. So it sort of makes sense why we don't have much left. I put in this clip from Jeff's map here, which some might be familiar with on the right. I actually can't see it here because there's something in the way, but it shows the trail east of Big Crow. You can see that trail there that goes down into the green forest protected area. That's the best like visitor accessible old growth in the park. I would say that probably counts as an old growth forest. There maybe is 40, 50 white pine that are old growth age, and they are huge, and the trail goes right through the forest. So I think if you ever have time and you're in that neck of the woods, that's probably the best old growth that you can visit in the park. Does anybody have questions on that one? I feel like this one probably this one might draw some questions. Good. Excellent.
The question in the chat there, how old are we talking about when we're saying old growth?
Yeah, well, what they've mapped here in the dark reds, over 200 years old, and that's from coring trees. So they can drill into a tree the same way that we do extract maple syrup, and they can pull out the core that essentially is the ring, shows the rings of the tree that they can age trees from. And so there is actually no really hard and fast definition of old growth forest, and it's like hotly debated amongst ecologists. So there really is no great answer for it from anybody. But in this case, generally 200 plus is what has, well, I think that's sort of been what's the standard for a long time is, but then the challenge is that's aging the tree. And there's a difference between an old tree standing in a young forest and an old forest that's never been disturbed. So there's another whole element to it. But generally, I know that this map, especially in the dark red, will be showing areas that probably haven't been logged. And in general, the ones I've been to of those are on really steep slopes where it would have been so hard to get into for early logging equipment. So that's primarily why they've been left. Yeah.
Just another one coming in the chat there, Ryan. How big an area or other aspects would be considered forest when you were talking about old growth trees versus old growth forest?
Yeah. Well, that's another good question. I guess there's no. Let's see. I think if you use the book Ecological Land Classification for Southern Ontario, a forest has to be half a hectare. So if I went by the sort of M&R textbook definition of a forest, I guess I'd say half a hectare. But I think that the white pine at forest at Big Crow maybe isn't quite even a half a hectare. So yeah, it's a bit of we try, I guess, to put a number on it, but it's just more like the one at the Dixon really is clearly a line of trees at the edge of the lake. There's no interior to it. If there's at least some meterage between the edge of it and the interior, then you might have some interior forest habitat. But if it's just a thin strip, it's clearly trees. So I don't know. This is something that gets debated all the time. No good answer to those. Is that it there?
Yeah, that's it in the chat for now.
Okay. Yeah. So the next point here, unfortunately, photos don't really do justice, but maybe it's best just observe by yourself. If you ever get a chance to go up to the Dorset Fire Tower, this view is looking south. So the main view in the window is looking south, and it's mostly oak and maple trees. And in the small window looking north, you can see a lot more dark green in there, which are white pine that are starting to reach over the canopy now. And the photo doesn't really do it justice, but if you go see it in real life, you can clearly tell that the sugar maple, they're mature, they've reached their height, and the white pine are now growing over top of them. And it's what we call super canopy. So essentially you have your general canopy, and then you have a super canopy of trees that are capable of attaining crazy heights like white pine. And this is what probably all of the forests of this region more or less look like, was a hardwood forest at its attained height that you see in the foreground here, but there would have been this mix of white pine into it. So that first map I showed that showed the west side of the park, primarily sugar maple, yellow birch, probably would have had a larger dominance by white pine before logging, before the start of logging at the very start, because that was really what they came for, was those super canopy white pines. And anytime I'm up on the tower with people that are interested in forestry, I always point out this view looking north, because you can really see, in some cases, maybe almost 10 meters, some of the white pines are over top of the canopy. So they're forming, the forest is getting old enough and the pines are getting old enough that it's starting to resemble older growth, super canopy, white pine, sugar maple forest. So the Dorset Fire Tower is a neat place to observe sort of old growth development, I guess you could sort of loosely call it. Okay, so on to the next topic from old growth. That's just another interesting topic to keep you interested on the plants of the Algonquin Dome, is the Atlantic Coastal Plain. So it's another rare vegetation community that we have on the dome. Although it's only on the edge of the dome, it's a pretty neat area that's unique in Ontario and really unique through everywhere in Canada except the eastern seaboard. So as the name implies, the Atlantic coast is an area that has, in some cases, wetland right up to the coast, like fens and bogs, just like we have. But they're influenced by the tide, and so is the water level. And so when the glaciers retreated, we know that they mix seeds from all over North America together. And by and large, when plants become used to where they live, they die off when they get transported to somewhere they don't like. And for some reason, we've had some plants from the Atlantic coast survive in little pockets on the edge of the Algonquin Dome and then down to Gravenhurst and a little bit up towards Parry Sound. And the interesting part about it is I took these pictures in the Frost Center, which is one of the known locations on the Algonquin Dome for Atlantic Coastal Plain. You can tell it sort of looks like the tide's going out, and the plants that are rare from this area specialize in this tidal zone, kind of where the water's going out. So there's some sort of mechanism that's not totally understood. Plants don't get studied nearly as much as other more interesting things, so we don't have a very good answer for it. But for some reason, they seem to like these sort of tidal bogs in central Ontario. This map sort of roughly shows, although I think there's a few errors on it, but the core of this Atlantic Coastal Plain kind of runs along the edge, the lower part of the Algonquin Dome. So sort of from the South Algonquin Panhandle towards the Frontenac area, and then curves up from Bala up towards Parry Sound. So we've got this sort of Atlantic Coastal Plain assemblage, we call it, assemblage being a grouping of plants that associate together on a certain habitat. So that's sort of an interesting feature of the lower Algonquin Dome. And it comes with a lot of stuff that we don't get anywhere else in the province, like these species here, Virginia meadow beauty and smooth sausage. So this, if you were to go to a swamp on the coast of Nova Scotia, you might have these two everywhere up the coast. And then in Ontario, they don't exist here, except we find them in these weird little pockets. So if you're in the frost center in late summer, both of these will be out, and you shouldn't see anywhere else, I don't think. And if you do, they're worth reporting. So that's another nice thing about having a lot of canoe trippers that know what they're looking at, because surely there's more that haven't been found yet, especially in the frost center area in the Western Panhandle. A few more, a little bit harder to see, like this Xeris montana is really tiny. It's hard to even take a picture of it, but it's like an alpine yellow-eyed grass, it's called. So it's not a grass, it has a flower, but again, both of these species would be something pretty common on the Atlantic coast and rare all the way across, or not found at all, and then sort of just deposited on the edge of the Algonquin Dome. Kind of interesting. And then these are a little bit hard to identify, but again, here's some sedge on the right and a beak sedge on the left. And the one on the left here especially like associates only with Atlantic coastal plain. You can kind of see in the background sort of like dried out lily pads and stuff. Again, it's that classic habitat of sort of the lake drying out and imitating a bit of a tidal zone. So pretty neat thing going on there. And then I'm not done. There's one more weird disjunct thing that we have in Algonquin, at least one more. And this is the Appalachia. So Appalachia being the old mountain range, when they died back, they sort of formed this distinct coastal, semi-coastal mixed forest, kind of similar to the forest we have of the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence, just a little bit more coastal influence and a bit of different species. And as you can see from this map, I used the range of the red spruce, which is a core Appalachian species. It doesn't occur anywhere outside of Vermont or anywhere in Ontario. These lower records or errors, really where this red circle is the only place really in all of Ontario that we find red spruce. So again, it's sort of this, the receding glaciers did a bunch of moving around of the seed banks, and red spruce so happened to get transported to and find habitat on the southern part of the Algonquin Panhandle. The interesting thing about them is that I find them always on the south shore of lakes where there's rocky, steep cliffs. And if you're on the south shore of the lake, that means you never really see the sun very much. It's always pretty cool there because the sun's always kind of behind you if you got rocks in behind you. So I think that they're a fan of the cool, sheltered southern shield lakes, but that's just sort of my assumption. That you can find them, I find them in a fair bit of lakes south, if you ever go south of like Welcome, Harry Rents, you know, that area, into the Gallipo Lakes, for example. I know that I started finding quite a bit of them in the Gallipo Lakes that the MNR wasn't aware of. So this is again just one of those things like where if you're like doing these backcountry trips and you get familiar with trees or plants or everything, you'd be surprised how often you're finding new stuff, because you're getting into areas that often the botanist world tends to not get into. So this is a good example of that. Red spruce, southern half of Algonquin Park. I probably would want to do some further reading. Like I won't go through into all the details of the ID of them. But I was saying earlier that when I paddled by a red spruce forest with my dad, before I pointed out to him what they were, he doesn't know trees at all, but he looked at them and said, those trees look kind of weird. So I feel like he already recognized that they are out of place. So I think that, you know, when you see them, once you start seeing them, you get an eye for it and you can start picking up where in the park they are. So that's kind of a neat one to know. And this other one takes a little bit more of a keen eye, but this is another Appalachian disjunct. Because of its ranking in Ontario, it would be considered one of the rarest ferns in Ontario. It's only found in the South Algonquin Panhandle and only in maybe less than sites. And I found it a couple times up in the Dividing Lake area, which is sort of a protected zone, sort of just on the west side of Algonquin Park. And It's a little bit tough to ID because we have this other, some might see this picture and think that they've seen it before, because we have a really closely related one called rock polypody or common polypody. It's got a few different names, but there's a few subtle differences to learn between the two. But if you there's a few papers actually on Google Scholar that would probably be the best place to start to learn the difference between them. But again, it's this Appalachian disjunct here. So this is the Frontenac axis, which has some Appalachian stuff going on. And then this one would probably be an error. And then this is the only place at maybe 6 spots there that they've been found in South Algonquin. And that's about it. So again, it's another one of those, they just got deposited and found some habitat up on the high points in the back in the park. And I guess kind of tying all that together, because I kept making a point that canoeists can do quite a bit, is that we have this, the maps I've been showing you I made in iNaturalist. So I just essentially was screening for certain species that are core representative of their group, and then using that to show where the group sort of occurs. But that's just one of the million things you can do with iNaturalist. What I took a picture of here is just species reported in Algonquin Park, 52,000. That's just from like all citizen scientists or actual scientists or anybody who has INAT can report. So if you don't even know what it is, you can take a picture of it and submit it, and odds are somebody can come along and correct it. And I know that the park ecologists do watch this. When you report rare ones or uncommon sightings, they'll contact you sometimes. They'll like email you on INAT and say, hey, is this actually where you found it or whatever? Or they might bounce it around and have a few people try to find the ID. Or, you know, with certain rare stuff like that fern, they might even request that you go back and take a sample if you know how to get back there, and they'll give you a little permit to go pluck it for them. So a lot of interesting stuff can come out of it if you start using iNaturalist. It really gives citizen scientists like a chance to do whole plant lists. If you were really good at doing plants, you know, you could go do a whole wetland evaluation essentially and submit all 48 species in that little wetland, and the MNR has now access to that data. So it's a pretty handy tool to use. I suggest that most people that are learning, it's even good for your own purposes, because I feel like you can learn plants 10 times as fast as back in the old days of having to go through the keys at the start of a manual. So anyway, that's as fast as I could get through all that. I don't know how close to half hour we are.
That was perfect. Ryan, thank you. Let's take a second then just to maybe let some of that sink in. And if there are some questions coming up, we can throw them into the chat right now. We'll have some time. We definitely have time to go through some of those questions. I saw there was one that came up earlier on from Byron about the, could seeds from these oligotrophic, is that how I'm pronouncing, oligotrophic plants be brought to dolomitic limestone quarries or alvars and grow there?
Well, in this case, you're dealing with plants that are on an acid base, which are not calcareous like dolomitic stone or alvar. And so generally that's one of the biggest separations in speciation, is between whether it grows on basic or acid soil. So odds are very little species that you could take off the Algonquin Dome that grows on granite and gneiss and stuff like that. It's used to acidic environments and planted in something with really high pH, like in an alvar. So, because that's one of the biggest separations between plants. So that wouldn't work. But if you took, if you had a bog that occurred in Southern Ontario, which is kind of rare, but if you had a calcareous bog, and the species in there were used to growing in a calcareous bog environment, and you had an alvar regeneration with boggy habitats, then that would work. But it wouldn't work from here to there. That's a pretty good question.
Any other questions coming up for folks? I've had a couple just in general, but if you do have any other ones, by all means, throw them in the chat. But Ryan, I'm curious, you as somebody who both like is a plant ecologist and knows a lot of this information as well as a canoe tripper and a guide. How do you see like the bridge between botany and plant ecology and knowing this side of things? How does that bridge to conservation in the park?
Well, I think like what I was bringing up here with like iNaturalist and stuff, that helps a fair bit. But I also think like that helps in terms of if you find rare stuff or whatever. But I think maybe even more so, like we were talking about before with people just learning, especially plants, because they're so visible and there's so many different species and they tell you about the soil they live in or the slope direction that it's pointing. Or they can tell you so much different stuff, or the history, glacial history and stuff like that, that you just end up appreciating it more. And then that people appreciate it more will obviously always result in good change, because they become the voters and whatever, right? That's probably worth even more than trying to track down some rare species, is to spread the appreciation that comes once you start learning, not just plants, but plants included for sure.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thanks for that.
I've got a question on that then. I think, to distill what you were saying is it's important to have a relationship with these natural systems, and to have a relationship. I think a good level of knowledge is really important, right? For anyone who's not familiar with this is a lot to download, and there's a lot of knowledge and there's a lot of information. Do you have like sort of top 3 takeaways, let's call it, of like things that you wish people would know, or things that like you would tell a set of parents taking their kids on their first trip, and say to them, like, you've got to make sure that your kids notice this or see that? Like, have you thought about that?
Yeah, I don't know, that might be a bit. I think the funny thing is, because a lot of these places do canoe trips, you don't have cell service, so this app wouldn't work. But then it's also like, I think that those old guidebooks do get a lot of people interested, because you can bring them out of cell service and it's just something sort of tangible. I feel like bringing a guidebook, even if it's a little bit irrelevant and it doesn't have all the species and stuff like that, I think that was how a lot of people used to always just get into it, is just trying to like line it up to the page, kind of like a puzzle or something. And I feel like that's always would be probably a good start, especially in a canoe trip when you don't have cell service and it just uses that guidebook. That's probably one good one. But in terms of like, I think what's probably best in that case, it maybe would be that as a parent, you already start learning it yourself, and then you find it interesting, and then you just like can't help but tell everybody around you, which is often what ends up happening.
Ryan, a couple of questions coming in through the chat here. Also a request to stop the share screen so that folks can see each other.
Oh, sure, okay.
Conversation space. But just while you're doing that, one of the questions that came in there was, what are some of the threats to the park currently? Maybe as far as biodiversity or plant life.
Yeah, okay. Well, it hasn't been too bad, but invasive species are kind of like anywhere that can be an issue. So I would say, invasive species are always going to be big for any environment. It's true with the aquatic environment with fish, especially in the park. But it's also true a bit with plants. Certainly things that we see taking over in Muskoka and Haliburton are a bit of a early warning of what could come to Algonquin Park. Even just the tread of your boots could technically bring in new species and stuff like that. And that's probably one of the big issues. What's my favorite plant? Well, that's not very specific. Is it the world, North America, Canada, Ontario, Algonquin Park? In Ontario, okay. My favorite plant in Ontario. Oh, that's a pretty good one. I guess I haven't thought of this before, but I'll come up with it. Okay, it's probably, well, my favorite group are the rushes, and there's this one rush that grows in flooded tall grass prairies in southwestern Ontario. It's nearly extinct, but I also am always inclined towards rare and endangered species. Yes. So I that's the first one that comes to mind, but it's rather boring looking. So I wouldn't bother Googling it and expecting something exciting. Okay.
Thanks for that, Garth. Another question here just from Paula. Is there any way that we as backcountry visitors can actually benefit the environment or minimize our impact?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Well, one thing I think that's important is knowing like the value of the vegetation on the edge of like this also goes for people with cottages and cabins and stuff, but also on campsites, even cutting down small shrubs and stuff. The first 5 meters of the shoreline are super important for catching all sorts of anything that you happen to spill or people intentionally spill and buffering it before it gets to the lake. And then it also keeps shoreline erosion down. So I know I've seen what might seem like minor, adjustments to like a lakeside campsite by removing shrubs and stuff. And then once the shrubs roots die, then that soil doesn't have as much capacity for buffering whatever the campsite gives to the lake, as well as you start eroding off and then silting the lake and stuff like that. So, I mean, that's one thing that comes to mind is like vegetation disturbance, but especially within what we call the riparian area, like around the edge. And then I guess one I should point out, because I showed a lot of like neat looking orchids and pitcher plants, is that most of those are really slow growing, and especially the pitcher plant takes forever to develop. And I know it's really tempting to like, I've seen so many times camp kids and they have like all have one pitcher plant each that they're going to dry and bring home and stuff like that. So, despite the temptation, like not picking stuff, and it's better just taking pictures of it. That's another one that comes to mind.
Awesome, thank you. I just had a question come in personally, and I'll just put this in here now. It's been really great to have Ryan come out and do this workshop. Just for folks on the call to be aware as well, we are doing this coming season from July 9th to 11th. It'll be a 3-day guided canoe trip workshop with Ryan and myself in Algonquin Park, taking a bit of a deeper dive into some of the things that we've covered on this call and seeing it up close and personal, being able to capture those own photos for yourself. So I'm just going to throw in the link to that if anybody wants to take a look. And if you have any other questions, by all means, do get in touch. But that is...
Do me a favor, actually.
What?
Don't click the link. If you Google us instead, if you're so inclined to even discover about us, if you just search the Trip Shed, it tells the Google overlords that people are interested in us, and it does good things for us. So if you want to look at us or support in any way, the best way to support is to type in the Trip Shed in Google, and the algorithm like that.
Awesome. Thanks for keeping that eye out. But yeah, that'll be 3 days of untapped Ryan knowledge to dip into. So super pumped for that one.
For better or for worse.
Yeah,
ask a question?
Brings his dog too. Yeah, Pine.
I was surprised when you said that there's not a lot of overlap between canoe trippers and people who are interested in plant identification and that sort of stuff. But then I think, well, okay, that kind of actually maps well onto my own experience, because my own interest in plants started for completely different reasons. I was into backcountry camping, but I was new to canoe tripping, so it didn't stem from that. But I was interested in wild edibles. So I was interested in wild edible plants because I did a lot of backpacking on land. And I'm wondering, in your experience, has you seen a sort of an uptick in interest in wild plant identification because of interest in things like bushcraft and stuff like that? I mean, I certainly see that reflected when I watch, bushcraft YouTubers and stuff like that. We're into that. But apart from that group, I don't know of any group of people who spend a lot of time outdoors who are interested in plants. Has that been your experience, or have you noticed a different pattern?
Yeah, that's interesting you brought that up, because I've always, even though I know a fair bit about it, I've always completely avoided it. And I don't share any knowledge about edible plants, basically, other than I'll sometimes correct an identification, but I don't know. And I haven't really learned a lot of it intentionally either. And so really, yeah, it's if you look at, how many plants you can actually eat out of the wild. You have to learn, I don't know how many, there's only so many. Sedges, there's maybe 400 Carex sedges, and you can't eat really realistic. I mean, you can eat them, but they can't actually eat any of them. So the people who are going to know those 400 Carex sedges, those types do not generally go more than 5 meters from their car, in my experience. And this is based off of reading all the papers of Ontario. I'm learning about this rare plant. Who's published stuff about it? What was your method? You walked 5 meters beside your car across Highway 60, 10 times. And so it's more based off of that. And the amount of knowledge that you need to be able to learn the edible plants and the ones to avoid that look like your edible plants is maybe like less than 1% of trying to learn even, Central Ontario type thing. So I was talking about the people who take it to the level where you could do it for a career, and who also happen to do lots of backcountry tripping type thing. That is extremely low. I mean, I don't know very many or any examples.
Yeah, that comports with my own experience, because my own interest in it was strictly instrumental. I really just wanted to know what plants were useful to me. I wasn't interested in identifying them out of intrinsic interest. It was strictly, what could I eat if I needed to? What could I use, for cordage and things like that? But of course, once you start, you then want to know, well, what's this other plant that I see everywhere that looks like this thing, but isn't the thing that I'm interested in? And slowly my interest expanded from there. And my wife really got quite good at it. Whereas my interest tended to be much more instrumental. But yeah, it's really disappointing to find out that there are not that many canoeists out there who are into that kind of stuff.
Well, not yet anyway. That was sort of the point of this.
Yeah, that's right. May I follow up with another question?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
So what about these apps like iNaturalist? And what I use mostly is something called Seek, and that seems to serve me fairly well. Do you think that's just targeting people who already have an interest and it's making it easier for them? Or do you think these apps actually help generate new interest that wouldn't otherwise be there, like significant?
I guess I wouldn't know about like how the interest gets generated. That's definitely not like my knowledge set, but I definitely know that everybody can use these apps, from like the absolute beginner that's just taking a picture of a plant and saying it's a plant and uploading it, to me using it for work 4 or 5 times a week or more, because there's so many different uses to iNaturalist, that you can use it for work or right down to learning the first plant you've ever learned. That I do know. It's quite useful for all that sort of stuff. Like I could turn on I might have a project somewhere, and I could zoom out a bit and then turn on a filter for all rare plants in Ontario. And then I get this list of what's been found within 10 kilometers of this project site. And before I even go there, I have a pretty good idea of, I haven't actually like seen that one for a few years. I better read about how to tell it from the other one. That's just one example of, how I can use it. So it's for everybody, I do find. And I believe Seek is, I don't actually know, but I believe Seek is made by iNaturalist, and I think that your information from Seek goes into iNaturalist. I'm pretty sure, but I've never used Seek.
That's awesome. Thank you for those questions, Martin. Any other ones coming in just as we wrap up, and extend some final words of gratitude to Ryan for offering up his time this evening? And if there are other questions that come up for you after, by all means, you can send them our way, and we'll pop them over to Ryan and try and get you an answer. Amazing. Well, I just want to say thank you all for coming out this evening. It's been really great to see everyone out and just see the interest in deepening our relationship to the land and to plants, and especially in Algonquin specific. I've done a bit of this learning down in the Guelph region, and it's really great to just like get how much diversity there is, a few hours north. So thank you for that, Ryan. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge with us. Thank you for the upcoming trip. Super excited for that. I think there are still a handful of spots left, so definitely check it out. If you have any questions, please do share. And if you have any time this evening, stick your head out the window or take a walk outside your front door and just go see what you see. See if you take a look at your plants around your house, the different lens, now that you've just got this broader context offered to you. I bet you do. Aaron, any final words you want? Or sorry, Ryan, go ahead.
I just said, although it looks like it's dark now, I'm not sure how much you're going to be able to see.
Bring a flashlight. Amazing.
But certainly
Thank
on your
you
next
all.
canoe trip, anyway, you might consider it, right?
Pardon?
Certainly on your next canoe trip now, I'm sure
Mhm.
lots of people will be considering it. Yeah.
I'd hope so. Absolutely. Awesome. Aaron, any final words you want to offer in there?
No, just a big thank you to Ryan and a huge thank you to everyone else who's on here. Really appreciate you being with us.
Amazing. Well, that is all for this evening. If you want to throw your mute off for a moment and just yell